Hi, this is Scott Bradfield. This is chapter 6 of reading Ulysses in the Bathtub. I forget what number we are in the overall scheme of this course. We're at chapter 6. This is often discussed as the Hades chapter. It has, when I first taught it years ago, I still have flashbacks to the first time I tried to teach this book. And I read all the different books about the chapter and all the allusions to Hades and the Cerberus and all the different, all the secret signs that Ulysses, that Joyce had snuck into this chapter to prove he was well read. And none of it matters. It's basically Bloom's going to the funeral of a friend who was a drinker, it sounds like, and his wife was quite crazy. And in the course of being there, he's put together with a lot of people he feels uncomfortable with and who feel slightly uncomfortable with him because he's Jewish and they know stuff about his life that he's embarrassed by. We'll go into that. And in the course of it, he thinks a lot about death. And at the same time, he starts to think about what he cares about in terms of life. So let's just read through. We're going to go through this I hope, fairly quickly. I want to say one other thing about the chapter. Up till now, however extreme and confusing sometimes the previous chapters were, I've been arguing that, from that board that we had up with our Western story, that basically Joyce is following very clear modernist techniques in telling stories. So cutting from what the character sees to what he thinks to what he hears to a sound he hears, that this sequence of events that occurs to our point of view are fairly consistent. And with this chapter, Joyce is going to start to break some of these rules. I'm not always sure why he does it, and I'm not always glad that he does. And I think it sometimes leads to confusion in these chapters that shouldn't be there. They can be confusing anyway, but I'll point out a few. There's a few little gimmicks with point of view. We start this story after this chapter very quickly, and we know it's Bloom's point of view after about a page or two. We have all the people getting into the car to follow the body to the funeral, to the cemetery, and we don't really know it's Bloom until the page 108, after a page in which he gets onto the car with all these other guys, and then we start to see and hear things through his eyes. Page 108. Are we all here now? Martin Cunningham asked. Come along, Bloom. Mr. Bloom entered and sat in the vacant place. He pulled the door to after him and slammed it tight till it shut tight. He passed an arm to the arm strap and looked seriously from the open carriage window at the lowered blinds of the avenue. One dragged aside, an old woman peeping, nose white flattened against the pane. Thanking her stars, she was passed over. Extraordinary the interest they take in a corpse. Glad to see us go, we give them such trouble coming. And we very quickly come into Bloom's point of view, his thoughts as he sees the old people looking at him and watching them go by and being glad it's not them who is being buried. And then Bloom quickly goes into a little fantasy about himself being buried and Molly fixing the sheets and preparing the winding sheet and so forth. So we're in his point of view. We're going to break that rule. We're going to be pretty much in Bloom's point of view throughout the piece, and then we're just going to kind of break it a couple of times. Now, as we're traveling and meeting the different characters in the coach, one of them is Mr. Daedalus. That's Stephen's father, and he will be a significant character in the rest of the book. And as we drive along, there's Mr. Cunningham and there's Mr. Powers. Martin Cunningham is this sort of a good-natured man. He's actually quite a sensitive person. He's always trying to make people feel comfortable, particularly Bloom, and he seems like a kind man. And as they're driving along, he points out that Bloom looks out the window and sees Stephen Daedalus and says to Mr. Daedalus, "There's your son, and your son and heir." And Mr. Daedalus says, "Is that Mulligan cad with him?" So Mulligan, who's really one of the most interesting character out of the Stephen Daedalus chapters, is a kind of Falstaffian, awful selfish, loud, arrogant, unpleasant, funny, entertaining person, and Mr. Daedalus doesn't like him. Probably basically because he bums money off people and doesn't pay them back. In the next page, he says, he's in with a low-down crowd, Mr. Daedalus snarled. That mulligan. And he starts talking about the family and how much he doesn't like that family. And in the course of listening to Mr. Daedalus complain about Stephen's friends, we learn an important fact about Bloom, which is 110, the fact that he really wishes he had a son. We know he had a son named Rudy. Rudy died at childbirth or shortly after, and he takes this occasion when he sees Stephen. The relationship of Bloom as the father and Stephen as his son is the recurring motif through the book, and it's pretty much hammered on for us here with Mr. Bloom, or Bloom thinking about Rudy, and if he lived, he would carry me on, and I can, he would make me live forever in a way. Okay, so we drive along. There's lots of chatting along in the car, and in the course of the car, Mr. Bloom thinks about, as they're traveling through Dublin, Mr. Bloom starts to recall in 112 his father asking him to take care of his old dog when he died. And we now know that Bloom's father died. We know he's been dead. But in the course of this chapter, we learn that his father committed suicide. So there's some nice little moments here as they get a raindrop spat on his hat as Bloom gets out of the car. And he's looking through the obituary pages, trying to find Dignam's name. There's lots of chatter about what's happened in the past few days, just, things, arguments in bars and so forth. Bloom is looking through the obituaries to see who died. Page 114, he starts to wonder what happened to the envelope, because he has that guilty secret of Martha's letter that's circulating through his pants pockets. And he went to the bath, and he's wondering where he put the envelope. So we're reminded of his guilt about that envelope. And as they're driving along on page 114, Martin Cunningham and Powers look out the window, and they say, oh, look, he doesn't see us. Yes, he does. How do you do? Who? Mr. Daedalus asked. Blazes Boylan, Mr. Powers said. There he is, airing his quiff. Just that moment, I was thinking. That's Bloom's thoughts. He was thinking about Blazes going off on this appointment to meet Molly. At the moment that they start talking about Blazes, we have this little recurring motif with Bloom is whenever something embarrassing happens, he pretends he doesn't see it. Mr. Bloom reviewed the nails of his left hand and those of his right hand. The nails, yes. Is there anything more in them that she sees? Fascination. Worst man in Dublin. So what do they see in him? What does she see in Boylan? And then the worst man in Dublin. So he's just enraged at this man who's going off to sleep with his wife. We go through, we start looking at a lot of statues. There's some funny stories here that sometimes are confusing. We learn a little bit about Mr. Powers has a girlfriend. I think she shows up later. And she's a barmaid. I think she's a barmaid in one of the pubs later. And he's keeping a girl on the side, though it's claimed that they don't have sex. He just likes to keep this woman in an apartment in town. We hear some other stories about different characters. They talk about the death of poor Paddy Dignam on page 119. Mr. Daedalus calls Dignam as decent a little man as ever wore a hat. And Bloom recalls him as a man with a big red face and a big red nose because he drank too much. And he had a crazy wife, too, which you can read for yourself. A procession goes by for a child that looks like an impoverished child or a stray child. And as it goes by, it gives us more occasions for Bloom to reflect on the loss of his son, Rudy. And at this point, about 120, as the men are just chattering, Powers, who's really the kind of insensitive guy of the crowd, says the worst thing of all is the man who takes his own life. And he starts to get all uppity about this, how people, sort of Catholic argument, they kill you, take your own life. It's the worst thing you could possibly do. And Mr. Cunningham, who's sort of a nice man, is saying, oh, well, that's cool. Let's not talk about it too much, because as he tells Powers later, Bloom's father killed himself. And we learn that on page 121 as Bloom recalls the inquest. On 121, he remembers the inquest in which a red-labeled bottle was discussed, and the verdict was death by misadventure, though there was a letter from my son Leopold, so it suggested that Bloom received a letter explaining why his father killed himself. Our train keeps going, and so they're going all over town carrying the corpse, and a huge herd of cattle comes through town. It's going off to be slaughtered, I think, and this makes some jokes about it. Mr. Powers calls them immigrants. He says immigrants belong to England. And for Liverpool, probably, Bloom. And whenever something comes up about money, he likes to speculate how much money they'll make. And he thinks about all this dead meat going off the streets. So more death. We just see nothing but death and annihilation through large parts of this chapter. They go past a pub, Dunphy's. They go past a house where a man was murdered, and the killer was probably gotten off by a good lawyer. Bloom is thinking about 126 is quite crowded in this carriage. And here's one of the places, 127. I just want to point this out because I do find this confusing when I read it. And I've read it enough times it doesn't bother me. But on 127, Bloom is in the point of view all through this. He hears everything, he sees everything, he thinks everything. Suddenly, at the bottom of 127, Bloom goes off talking to somebody, and Martin Cunningham whispered, I was in mortal agony when we were talking of suicide before Bloom. What? Mr. Power whispered. How so? His father poisoned himself, Martin Cunningham whispered. At the Queen's Hotel in Ennis. You heard him say he was going to Clare anniversary. Bloom is planning to go to Clare later in the week, and it's suggested here by Cunningham that it's the anniversary of his father's suicide. Now, I don't understand that scene in some ways because it's almost like it's been plugged in to give us some information, which Joyce doesn't usually do. It'll happen a couple more times, so just be careful now. He's not going to be as stable with the point of views, and I'm often tempted to think, well, Bloom is hearing this. He's not. And we're going to see a lot of this happen in the next chapter about the journalists. So they go in the procession with the children are all there. They talk about friends. They talk about a whip round, getting money together to help the kids get into school, now that their father is dead. Bloom watches the father, Coffee, give the funeral oration, and he's often saying, oh, I thought Coffee, that's right. It sounds like coffin. Bloom had thought that the priest presiding was named Coffin, and the term coffin keeps coming up earlier in the book. But his name is Coffee, and he speaks in Latin, and Bloom just kind of sits there thinking, because this is all, he thinks it's all hocus pocus, the most Catholic church stuff. He likes the rituals, he likes some of the beauty of it, and he likes the idea of taking girls into the churches, but he doesn't take much of it seriously. On page 132, someone mentions that Stephen Dedalus' mother and that Mr. Dedalus' wife is buried here, and Mr. Dedalus starts to cry. Mr. Dedalus has a huge family, had this over-worn out woman as a wife who died, and he's upset about it, still upset since she died. And the next page, Bloom reflects on broken hearts. Dignam died of a heart attack, and Dedalus is crying about his wife, and the notion of the broken heart, and that this whole graveyard, and we start to go into some fantasies here of Bloom's, which are quite beautiful and really well written, about all these broken hearts and livers and lungs and pieces of people, and he starts thinking about the church promising there'll be a resurrection of all these dead, damaged, broken people. And Bloom thinks of it as a horror story. The idea that there will be a resurrection is horrifying. We go along, and I don't think Bloom hears this, but the other men in the procession start talking about Molly and how when she was young, she was a good armful to dance with, and that she was, and someone says she still is. And she's that notion that she's a lively, passionate, beautiful, good-looking woman is brought up. And they mention that Bloom used to work at Healy's. He used to be a salesman for the stationers. And we go through and we start thinking about page 136. While we're going through all this boring ceremonies, and we're inside Bloom's head, he again, as usual, Bloom thinks, boy, it'd be nice to have sex with a nice-looking girl here among the tombstones. He says, it would be a spice of pleasure. In the midst of death, we are in life. Both ends meet. So life and death in some humping between the tombstones. And we go through all these tombstones and Bloom's. That's one of the fantasies that goes through his head. We're almost near the end of this. There's one or two passages I want to talk about, but one of the characters, there's one character that Bloom can't identify, and he's simply known as the man in the Macintosh. He's wearing a Macintosh, and nobody knows who he is. And that's a character who has a very brief existence in this book, and he has inspired hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of essays. You don't need to worry about it, just the man in Macintosh. It's almost like death. It's like an anonymous character at the funeral. And Bloom is starting to think, why do we even bury people? Why don't we just have one casket, put them in the casket, then throw them out? Because all these things are just getting ruined and damaged. So he starts to fantasize about getting rid of all these people in a much more industrious way. There's a very funny little passage here of page 139 where he imagines how horrible it is to actually die. And he sits there thinking, well, it is a long rest. Feel no more. It's the moment you feel. So after you're dead, you may feel no more. But let me pause this for a second. Sorry for the little break, a little cut there. I had to close the door. He says, you can't believe it when death comes. And these little thoughts that go through the person's head when they die, this must be a mistake. You must be coming for somebody else. Try the house across the street. You know, when death comes through the door, you must be in the wrong house. And we continue these little digressions and these little reflections. They start to talk about Parnell. A lot of the statues and the tombstones are related in the thoughts of all the men there as the politics of the time. Parnell was, an advocate of home rule. Had a long, I don't remember most of it. I think there was a woman involved. He was seeing a woman, or he was known as being an adulterer, and it ruined his political career. Joyce talks about him, and he was one of the last people, I think, that at the time that they thought could bring home rule to Dublin and to Ireland. Again, don't quote me on the history. And there's a lovely little passage after they go looking for Parnell's tombstone. And I just want to read this quickly. He talks about, look at all this money. This is like industry for death. The industry of the cattle going through the streets, and the industry of all these people being buried in expensive tombs and expensive coffins for a huge waste of money. And Bloom values money. He thinks that money should be put to good use. Page 143. Mr. Bloom walked unheeded along his grove by saddened angels, crosses, broken pillars, family vaults, stone hopes praying with upcast eyes, old Ireland's hearts and hands. More sensible to spend the money on some charity for the living. Pray for the repose of the soul of. Does anybody really? Plant him and have done with him. Like down a coal chute, just toss him down a coal chute. Then lump them together to save time. All Souls Day, 27th, I'll be at his grave. 10 shillings for the gardener. He keeps it free of weeds. Old man himself, bent down double with his shears clipping, near death's door. Who passed away? Who departed this life as if they did it of their own accord? Got to shove, all of them. Who kicked the bucket? More interesting if they told you who they were. He's talking about the tombstones and seeing an old man doing some clipping. And then he thinks, well, let's these tombstones about, oh, may he rest in peace. He was the greatest father of all time. She was the greatest mother. They should actually write on the tombstones what these people did in their lives. They should say things like, I traveled for cork lino. I was a salesman for cork lino. I paid 5 shillings in the pound. Or a woman's with her saucepan. I cooked good Irish stew. All of these should be the tombstones, according to Bloom, as he's walking through. So he goes on. He thinks about putting gramophones. So when someone dies, you could record their number, their voices, and you could put a gramophone on each tomb, so Grandpa could talk to you on the record player when you came by. He looks down into one of the unfilled graves, Dignam's, I believe, and sees a big rat. And then he starts to think, there's this horrible world of death, and the only world worth living in 146, he says, is the warm beds, the warm, full-blooded life. I mean, there's a hedonist in old Bloom, and it's just the physicality of life. You have sex in the funeral, in the cemetery, rather than just stand over dead bodies. And then at the end of he has a kind of nice little feeling there, a little kind of a little epiphany, as they say in Joyce scholarship, that okay, well, we can find life even in the midst of death. And then he sees a lawyer, I believe, talking to Cunningham, and he sees that there's a bang on the man's hat. And he walks up to him at the very end of the chapter and says, oh, you got a little ding in your hat there. And the man looks at him really rudely. Perhaps he looks kind of like being even a bit bigoted. Maybe he's looking at him as he's not one of my crowd, or he's Jewish, or whatever the man's thinking. And he says, oh, thank you, in a kind of rude way. And Bloom's quite hurt. He's hurt at this. He just wanted to be kind to this man. He's quite rude. And then within about a paragraph, Bloom thinks, well, maybe he'll feel bad about that later, and I can hit him up for some ads. So as soon as Bloom, the personal hurt is over, Bloom thinks, yeah, maybe I can work this out later. Okay, so there's Bloom. Bloom at the funeral parlor. The next chapter is quite funny. It's a kind of a satire on the journalistic profession in England and Dublin, which is pretty filled with horrible people, and a lot of drinking. And that's the next chapter. Point of view is going to be slipping and sliding all over the place in that chapter. So if you read it before we meet, be prepared. It's going to go back and forth. And Stephen Dedalus comes back into the scenes, and he and Bloom are going to pretty much pass in the night a couple of times. Okay, so have a great week. Enjoy reading Ulysses. There's some funny stuff in this chapter, and some quite powerful nightmarish visions in it too. Okay, bye.